are they? My Zoomers, can you still hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So there are 12 books in a section we call that are regarded as the minor prophets. There are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Hope I said those all to your liking. So you can find these 12 books. You can find them in the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. In the Tanakh, the Jewish version of the Bible, they are found in the second section. So in a Jewish Bible, there are 3 different sections. There's a Torah, the instructions, the first 5 books that are in what we call the Old Testament. Then after that is the prophets, the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets include, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, I apologize, but they include writings we wouldn't typically include, so like Kings and Chronicles, I believe, are included in the former prophets. The prophets we wouldn't usually name as such, and then the latter prophets are the major and the minor prophets, so like Isaiah, Ezekiel, and all those I just named. Okay? In the Old Testament section, they're the last 12 books after the major prophets and Lamentations. So they kind of end off the Old Testament in the Christian scriptures. Okay? They are called the minor prophets. Why? Does anybody know why they're called the minor prophets?
They're short.
That's right. Do you want to add anything to that, Cheryl?
No, that's what I was going to say too.
They're just shorter than the rest of them. They don't have as many chapters, so when anybody is talking about these 12 books, they're called the 12, the minor prophets. It's just because they're shorter. They're just shorter books. That's how we're also able to go through them in a few months, with a few of them just having 2 Sundays, right? So we'll definitely be going through all of them, thankfully, over the course of our Bible study. And again, that's the only noted difference, is that they're just shorter than the rest of them. Okay. Any other questions? All right, we're going to move on to what is a prophet? What do you associate when you hear the word prophet? What do you think of? Future. Future. Good one. I'm going to write these up here. What else?
Warnings. Warnings.
Warnings. What else?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. Anything else?
Truth telling.
Does that have a hyphen in the middle?
It's English, whatever you want to do.
Truly. All right, so we have what we associate with a prophet is truth telling, future, warnings, and wisdom. This is going to be great for foreshadowing later on, so I'm excited about that. Okay.
Very prophetic.
Very prophetic. Oh my gosh. Are we in a minor prophets Bible study this morning? I think we are. Okay. The primary mission of a prophet was to reveal the specific message of God to a nation or a person. That's it. That's like the baseline, cut and dry. They're just supposed to be sharing a message to a group of people or to a person. Okay? So primarily what we see in the scriptures is, right, they are speaking to the Israelite people, to the Israelite nation. If you want to go ahead and turn to page 184 in your Bibles, we're about to get in there. It starts Deuteronomy Chapter 29. Okay, so they're speaking primarily to the Israelites. There are a couple that speak to outside or Gentile nations, like, Jonah. The story of Jonah is pretty popular, speaking to Nineveh, which is known to be an Assyrian part of Assyria. And the centrality of their message was that covenant relationship with God, right? So they're always referring back to that covenant relationship to God. And this time, this was a typical relationship, contract. I'm thinking of contract. I'm thinking of relationship between like a king and their people, right? So God said, I'm going to do something similar to what you're used to, right? God is a God of context always. I'm going to do something similar to what you're used to, but instead it's going to be a covenant, right? Covenant is different than a contract. I think we talked about it in a Bible study previously, right? They're different. A covenant is a decision that is made. It is between two people. It's kind of like a circle instead of linear, right? One affects the other affects the other, right? So God and the Israelite people made this decision to be in covenant with one another, right? God said, I got your back. You go ahead and do the things that I've instructed you to do. And the reason why is the main point of this covenant is life, right? It's to bring you life. It's to have you make sure you have the best life possible by following these rules. So we're going to go into Deuteronomy chapter 29. Would somebody go ahead and read the first verses 1 through 9?
I can do that.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. The great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders. But to this day the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. The clothes on your back have not worn out, and the sandals on your feet have not worn out. You have not eaten bread, and you have not drunk wine or strong drink, so that you may know that I am the Lord your God. When you came to this place, King Saran of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan came out against us for battle, but we defeated them. We took their land and gave it as an inheritance to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Therefore, diligently observe the words of this covenant in order that you may succeed in everything that you do.
All right, we're going to read a little bit more. Can somebody read 10 through 20?
You stand assembled today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the leaders of your tribe, your elders, and your officials, all the men of Israel, all your children, your women, and the aliens who are in your camp, both those who cut your wood and those who draw your water, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, sworn by an oath, which the Lord your God is making with you today, in order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, as he promised you, and as he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I am making this covenant sworn by an oath, not only with you who stand here with us today before the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here with us today. You know how we lived in the land of Egypt, how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed. You have seen their detestable things, the filthy idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold that were among them. It may be that there is among you a man or a woman or a family or tribe whose heart is already turning away from the Lord our God to serve the gods of those nations. It may be that there is among you a root sprouting poisonous and bitter growth. All who hear the words of this oath and bless themselves, thinking in their hearts, we are safe, even though we go our own stubborn ways, thus bringing disaster on moist and dry alike. The Lord will be unwilling to pardon them, for the Lord's anger and passion will smoke against them. All the curses written in this book will descend on them, and the Lord will blot out their names from under heaven.
Thanks, Mary Jane and Jennifer. So this seems like harsh words, right? But again, foreshadowing to what we will hear in the next few weeks, right? This is very much real. It is very much what we hear the prophets say. But there's more to it, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But so knowing that this is the basis, right? This is what God has told God's people is going to happen. We are in covenant relationship. I freed you from Egypt, and all I ask is that you are in covenant relationship with me, and kind of don't mess things up, right? Don't mess things up. If not, some bad things will happen, right? We also have to acknowledge the context of that time, right? War was a very reoccurring theme among most of the nations in the ancient Near East, right? This person took over this person took over this person. So it's very much a part of history. But what the minor prophets do is try to make meaning out of that destruction, out of that war, out of that violence, and out of that hardship, right? They're trying to understand how things could happen to them. And so again, this is a basis for that. It's going back to most of the prophets going back to your relationship with God, your covenant with God. So again, the words that the prophets speak are not of their own will and formation. They were called by God, or God revealed themselves to the prophets, right? So their primary role, many people would say, is to warn God's people. Is to warn them of, hey, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and you're not doing, something bad is going to happen, right? And it's not actual future prophesying. It's not saying, I've seen the future and this is what's going to happen. It's very much part of their context. They're standing in society and they're looking around and they're seeing what's going on, and out of that, they are creating conclusions. It's not that they have special powers to see the future. It's that they understand cause and effect, right? They've seen it in their own lives. They've seen it around them, right? And so that's the first thing. And again, it's that secondary role is to show that future, right? Just to show what will happen in the cause and effect, right? Again, they dealt with the present and the past. They know what's happened before, and they know what might happen again. They see what's happening now, and they know what might happen again because of that. Is there anything in the chat to share, Mary Jane?
It sounds like Betty's having trouble with her audio.
Okay. Is anybody else having trouble by chance? No. Betty, you want to try to leave and come back in and see if that'll work?
She's muted. You're muted, Betty.
I can hear Mary Jane just fine, and I've got my hearing aids as high as they'll go, and my.
Okay. I'll try to speak a little bit louder.
I'll just try to tune and catch what I can.
Okay.
I have a question about something in scripture.
Yes.
This is not any of the main points or thrust or anything, but I was not aware of this. It said, the foreigners living among you who chop your wood and carry your water. Did they enslave people out of these conflicts, or, take captives and use them as servants or as enslaved people? I never heard of that before. Really?
And Julie, keep me honest, but typically servanthood back then was more like they needed help, and so they would do things in order to have repayment, right? So especially within, I believe, the Israelite context, right? There are people on the outskirts who need help, who need food, and they may be a foreigner, and so therefore they might come and say, hey, I'll do work in exchange for goods, right? That was the typical model, especially specifically to the Israelite community. Other places definitely kept slaves, but from what I remember in scripture, it was more of, hey, take care of the people who are coming to you and saying, we need help.
Like indentured servanthood.
Yeah.
So you would work for a certain amount of time to repay your debt.
Yeah. But I think that's a good point too. They're included in this. They're included in this covenant. So it's really interesting when we hear that the minor prophets talk to other nations, right? Because
Wow, but you can't hear if I
And
do it.
they'll go into it, but maybe the other nations have been a part of that. They've been indentured servants, or they've looked to Israel for help or in relation as a neighbor. And so how does that mix in, with a nation that doesn't necessarily follow, God, Yahweh, but has been a part of and maybe have mixed in with the Israelite people? Right? We don't get a lot of that in this section or detailed in this section, but it is talked about. And as we know, later on will also be talked about. Does that answer your question, Cheryl? Any comments on it? Any thoughts?
Oh, thank you, but I do think it's striking that the covenant included these people who were not Israelites.
Yeah, it is. It says a lot. Speaks volumes. So we're going to keep going in the essence of time. So what type of people did God use in the role of prophet? Right? So we typically think of a prophet as like a person who stumbled off the street and is just speaking out loud, right? I don't know about you, but that's a typical image that I get of prophet is some dude who's just talking nonsense and people are like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, you need to stop. They're on their stool out there. But surprisingly, the prophets had a lot of skills. They were typically a part of well-recognized institutions such as the temple, the kingdom, right? They're also, there's a few farmers and other tradespeople in there, but these people had skills. They could talk. They could form stories and ideas, and again, see the cause and effect in ways that other people weren't paying attention to or cared enough. Right, but we also know that the prophets, like Isaiah, one of the writers or one of the speakers in Isaiah, they understood a military complex. Right, they were instructing the king on what you should do as your next move. Unfortunately, the king didn't listen to them, but they understood the complexities of life during that time. It wasn't that they were just somebody off the street spouting stuff. They were well versed in their political climate. They were well versed in the covenant, most likely. Right? They were well read. They were learned people. So that's important to note in this as well. I would say, as it is, today, today's context, we have that divide of people, who are studied or learned, or those who know street smarts, right? It's kind of that divide at times of people who we may see up there who know the things and try to tell us things versus the people down here who are living among us and working and doing life, right? So I understand now why people didn't want to listen to the prophets all the time. They're up there, they're descendants of the kings or like the king's court. What do they know? They've been living this life before, but they're also surprisingly part of the community at times. And so with that, I just want to note one more thing in specific to the difference with prophets within the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, and the Christian scriptures, right? So for the Israelites, the Tanakh, all of the writings together, they were used to help make meaning of life, meaning of disruption that happened, of restoration that happened, and the prophets were the speakers to that. They said, this is why the destruction happened. This is how we restore one another. And it's kind of a cycle. It's not just linear. It's not just the progression in history. It's, again, looking back at what happened. So how do we make meaning out of that? How do we live our lives in regard to Yahweh and to one another? Right? For the Christian scriptures, that is similar, but it ultimately, we know that many, and as I was going through this, right, primarily Christian writers, their ultimate goal is pointing to Jesus, right? Everything the prophets is pointing to the second coming of Christ, right? For our Jewish siblings, that for those who look at the Tanakh, just those what we call the Old Testament, for them that doesn't apply. For them, it's how do we make meaning of this life, of destruction, of war, again, of violence? How do we make meaning of that, and how do we create life? And ultimately, how do we create hope? Which I think is different than what we typically hear, especially as it regards the prophets, right? Any questions or comments on a prophet? No? All right, we'll move on. Okay, so what is the timeline what time are we talking about for these minor prophets? And again, I apologize. I have a beautiful timeline that I will get to you eventually that shows everything. All the prophets in regards to things like the divide of the northern and southern kingdoms. So Israel was one nation, and then when King Solomon died, it was split among his children, and there became the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom, there were 10 tribes. In the southern kingdom, there were 2 tribes. I don't remember those tribes exactly in this moment, but I will get that for you. But that was a huge divide, right? You had this nation that had just come out of bondage, and then one of their most important kings dies, and then they split, right? So what happens when it splits? It becomes weaker, right? You have a weaker nation now that they're split. But even then, it seems interesting, right, that the northern kingdom with 10 tribes, in conversation, actually in preparation with this with Matt, it was interesting. He said that there is evidence to believe that those 10 tribes weren't as cohesive, weren't as together as we would like to think they were, because the southern kingdom had Jerusalem. It had the temple. That's where all the power came from. That's where all the edicts, everything was held there, right? That was the most important place. And if that most important place to Jewish identity is not part of your kingdom, they had a place that was central where they built another temple, but in reality, it's not the same, right? It doesn't do the same thing. So what happens in 1720, 1721, the Assyrians come through and they take that northern kingdom. They take them. And again, because they're not cohesive, they probably don't have a strong army. They probably aren't talking to each other about how to fight this new enemy. So they get taken over, right? And so this time, okay, let me say my next piece before I say what I want to say. So you just have the southern kingdom now, right? The southern kingdom, they think they're doing great. They still have the temple, everything's going great. And then we have the Babylonians who come in. And in 586, they go ahead and they take over the southern kingdom, and the temple is destroyed. The focal point of identity for the Israelite people, for the Jewish people, is destroyed, right? So this time of Babylonian captivity is called the exile, right? Anytime before that is pre-exile. Anytime after that is post-exile. So all of these prophets, the major, the minor prophets, anytime you talk about them in regard to timeline, in regard to timing, anything like that, they are within one of those 3 categories, right? So the minor prophets, surprisingly, none of them write. There's no writings within the time of the exile. They're all either pre or post, right? They're saying, hey, this is going to happen, hey, this is going to happen, and then it happens, and then they're looking at restoration afterwards. What happens now that the temple is destroyed and people are able to slowly go back to their homeland after being in captivity, right? So in 538 is when the Persians or the Medes go ahead and defeat the Babylonians. So it's not a long stretch of time. In numbers wise, but for the people, obviously, it was a long point. But then they're able to slowly go back to their home and to rebuild and to restore, right? There are 2 timelines that I have that I will give you. One of them just shows the minor prophets in regard to these 3 events. And then another one I found on the internet that also shows the other books, so the major prophets and those other books during the time, like Ezra and Nehemiah, and where they kind of fall in line with when the writings of the minor prophets occur. Okay? So that is the timeline. So it's about 400 to 450 years that spans this time. Any questions on timeline?
There's something in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll have to get to it. Okay. It's Cheryl. Wouldn't these writings have a timeline that is BCE?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Correct.
Yes.
So I apologize because I have a timeline that shows that. But one last important thing on the timeline is there's a difference between the prophet who spoke to the people and the difference between the actual written word, right? So even those two audiences, and even as we read it today, are completely different, right? So there's things you can do when you write things down that you can include if you forgot, that you can expound upon, that you can add to, that you can, make beautiful. So they are a little bit different. So that we do have a sense or a timeline, and each of our teachers will go through that within each book, right? What the proposed timeline is, who the author they think it is, right? Who's it attributed to, but is it truly that author? They're going to go through all of these things for each of these books. We're going to go through the major outline and themes right now, but just know that, again, the prophet is supposed to speak to a people within a time. And again, that might even change from when it was written down. But we have what is written down, right? So we make meaning out of that.
No, but when you say there's a change, do you mean as we interpret it, or as just within a particular time frame, then it sort of morphs into something different?
Yes.
Okay, the last part.
Both parts.
Oh.
Yep. So how it morphs into it, and then how we understand it as a people, right? And we'll get to that in the questions to ask. I didn't include it in the outline, but how do we make meaning out of that today, in 2022, as people who live in San Diego and live in La Mesa or San Diego, California, right? Where we may not relate to these people. We may not relate to what's going on in these books. So how do we make meaning out of it, especially in something that was changed and transformed? Especially for people who actually went through it, and then maybe writers who were writing about it, but maybe not have experienced it. Right? There's a difference between writing it down and after hearing it heard over multiple iterations, and actually having lived and experienced it. Right? And again, your memory changes constantly. So even if it happened to you, you may remember things differently. Your brain doesn't remember every single time you think of something exactly the same, which is kind of wild, but also important here, right? It's also different when you hear something for the first time versus now you're studying this, right? If you hear the guy on the street preaching from a soapbox, it's very different than when you read it later on and like, oh, this was important. Oh, this was history. Oh, this mattered, right? Or why didn't my ancestors understand? Well, it was provided differently. So that's a really great question for asking it. So yeah, it'll make a difference, and we'll see it, and we'll talk about it as we go through each book too. Okay, we're doing great on time. We're going to move on to the outline unless anybody has any other questions regarding timeline. Yeah, so it's between 900, 800 BCE to about 400, 450. Okay.
I forget what BCE is. What's the E part?
Originally,
Common era.
thank you. And in my notes, I didn't even include the B. I just do Common Era, CE, because that's what most use today. It used
Common
to be,
era is us.
yeah. Oh,
And then before the common era. So the reason they made this was to get away from like Jesus being the center of it, even though we just use the same dates.
yeah, yeah.
So for like our Jewish brothers and sisters, it's a little bit better of a terminology because they're not acknowledging that Christianity kind of took over. So before the common era is just BC, and the common era is AD.
There you go.
Okay, we have a message from Mandy.
Tell us, Mandy.
It's important to remember that the prophets were the ones who were called to share the message of Yahweh, no matter what it was, to whomever they were called to share that message. This is what distinguishes them from the false prophets of the time.
And within each, I think within each book, I could be misremembering that, but they'll share about how that happened, their story of being called, or God coming to them and asking them to speak, right? So each prophet has their own story of how that happened, or at least almost every prophet has it, not every single one, but And some of them have more detail than others, and that's what's really hard as well. And that some have more detail than others about how that came to be. But thank you, Mandy, so much for sharing that with us. Okay, so this is just a basic outline of the books. They don't happen exactly the same way. Again, between each book, they may have different priorities. They do have different priorities, so they're going to have different outlines and different themes and different things they talk about. But for 4 or 5, for the outline and themes, these are kind of like the basic, scholarly, what people see within each of these books and say, this is important, pay attention. Right, so for the outline, it begins with a warning of impending judgment because of the nation's sinfulness, right? So you weren't following covenant, you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing, and this is what you were, and then the description of it, so this is what you didn't do and what you should have done. And then a description of the coming judgment, so because of that, this is going to happen to you. And then a call for repentance, right? So I'm showing you what you did wrong, but also I'm showing you what you can do to repent, to make it right. And then a promise of future deliverance depending on the circumstance or situation, right? So with that, I'm going to go quickly into the important things. So there are 3 important things that I'm going to touch upon, or I say that I found, and your teachers for the week, for the next few weeks may expound, or they may change them up a little bit depending on the book that they're in. But these are 3 things that I found in my reading and my studies. So, sorry, it's a little small. So the first one is disruption or disaster. The second one is restoration or survival. And the third one is hope or life. Okay. So disruption and disaster, it's that part of calling them to repent for not following the law, right, for sinning, and to make meaning as a nation, as a people experiencing war, devastation, and violence, right? It's saying this is part of the cycle of life. This disruption, this disaster that you're experiencing is part of the cycle of life. Again, going back to especially our Jewish siblings who look at these writings and look to the prophets to understand what's been going on in history and how to make meaning of that, right? So there's disruption and there's disaster in the cycle of life, right? But then there's restoration. For those who survived, there is restoration. There is constant talk about the prophet is the person who talks to God, but also who talks to the people for God, but also talks to God for the people. It is the person who says to God, what the heck, God? What the heck? Why is this happening to our people? Hey, good morning. Come on in.
Have I come to the wrong place or everybody walk?
Morning,
John.
Hey, Jack. Come on in.
All right, I won't get into these.
Okay, no worries.
Hang out.
All right. Right? So it's saying, okay, they listened, destruction happened. How are you going to restore them? It constantly talks about a God of forgiveness, right? It's so funny. A lot of them start again with this disruption and this, you're terrible. You didn't listen to the law. And then it goes really quickly into, but God will forgive you. Like at the end of the day, God is the God who wants you because God has made covenant relationship with you. And in that disruption and in that disaster, in the exile by those waters, God has been with you, right? So one thing that I read that I thought was so profound that I've never really thought of before. But this talks about this restoration, this survival especially, moves into hope, moves into life. It says that you were the loser, you lost the war, you lost the fight, but God still cares about you, right? God still cares about you. God is looking to bring new life for you. God is looking out for you. God was there where you in exile, and God will be there afterwards to help you restore, to help you make new life. right? And that cycle continues pretty often, especially in the ancient Near East, right? People took each other over all the time. There was constant war, there was constant violence, and then there was what do you do with the aftermath? How do you make life? How do you, right? But there's hope, there's potential, there's something next, there's something coming. And the prophets try to make that clear. That it doesn't just end here at the disruption disaster point. It's not all over, even though you lost. There's more. There's hope, there's potential, there's life, right? It is telling those who survived, it is for those who survived and refused to let death have the final say, right? Death doesn't have the final say in this story, in this cycle, right? God does. Not those other gods, Yahweh does. So, yeah. Again, God is in those borderlands. God is in exile with us throughout the whole process. And again, those prophets get to say the things they get to say and then say, hey, God, make good on your promise too.
Okay, we have a thing in the chat
Yes, please.
from Cheryl. Let me find it again. I like what it said in the outline in Restoration about God who takes up residence in the borderlands with the displaced people. And Betty's saying she can't read the outline. Maybe possible to send it later.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely send it later.
Yeah.
For sure. Any questions on these three themes here? And again, these themes are like throughout all of the prophets, but then they'll have their own agenda. They have their own thing that they're focused on. The people they're talking to. Context matters in all of this. But John, go ahead.
Two questions, and I don't know if they fit into what the framework is, but who started Deuteronomy? Do you know what that word means? And two, I think the prophet in the cooperation was Moses.
Yes. So Moses is the greatest, right? He's called the greatest prophet because he's the only prophet who came actual face to face with God.
Okay.
Right? These other prophets were called. Deuteronomy is 5, right? 5.
Second law.
Second law, that's what Deuteronomy means? There you go, second law. So Moses is the greatest prophet, right? Because he came face to face with God and then provided this covenant that we read in chapter 29. Right, so again, that is the base, that is the framework for what happens here, right? We read about the sin and the disaster that would happen if you didn't keep on your covenant. But what I think is interesting is if we don't see there, but that is very real and very true in the rest of the prophets and the rest of the book, is this talk about restoration of those who survived and the hope and the life that is for them, right? That is why the covenant was made ultimately, right, is to bring hope and life to the Israelite people, to have the best of the best, to have that land of milk and honey from God, right? So that continues even in the midst of even while disaster is happening, the prophets say, hey, God is still here. God will never leave or forsake you, right?
Are you wondering why we're in Deuteronomy for the minor prophets? Was that part of your?
No, I'm curious what Deuteronomy means.
Oh, okay.
Do you have an idea?
Just was wondering. Yeah. Do you have something in the chat box?
Okay, I do. Can you mute Kathy, Mary Jane? Might help Betty hear better. We can hear Kathy breathing. Oh no!
No, it happened.
And
Yeah.
it makes it a little harder to hear Tessa.
Gotcha.
So it looks to me like Kathy is muted.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, for muting yourself. Yeah, it just happens. People's computers take different noises.
Yeah.
Any other questions on these things? All right, so we're moving on to the last section here, questions to ask. Right, so while reading the minor prophets and while going through them, we'll let you know what book we'll be in and see if while you're if you can read it in one sitting or read it multiple times. Some of them aren't very long, so you should be able to do so. But while reading it, we can ask, what can we know about the prophet, right? Some of them have a good amount of description, some of them don't whatsoever, right? So, and then what is going on in the country during this time? So what events, what part of the timeline are they in? That the situation they're writing in and the people they're writing to, right? So what is the timeline? What is the style of writing, right? Again, these prophets or the writers of these books had different skills. They wrote differently. They did that on purpose depending on what their whole focal point is. There's some language that is used, some markers. I didn't write it down. I apologize. There are some markers that the different prophets use to start a saying and to end a saying. They may start it and then end it with the same words, so you understand this is the full picture, beginning to end. This is what you should pay attention to. They may say, the Lord God came to me saying X, Y, and Z, right? So there are specific markers that some of the prophets may have in their writing, so we should pay attention to those as you're going through. If you have time to read them. And then again, what are they talking about? What is their ultimate goal? Who are they talking to? What are they talking about? Especially as it pertains to these three themes and the bigger picture of their timeline, of their context, of who is being addressed here. Who's the actual audience? Who's a perceived audience, right, in the text? And then what difference does this make, right? So in my reading, it was interesting to read, right? So as people, especially today, in this setting, who may not have experienced the cycle, how do we make sense? How do we make meaning of reading these prophets, right? Most of us haven't gone through this cycle, but we know of violence, right? We know of war. We know of destruction. We've seen those nations, right? We've been part of it before, indirectly, explicitly, implicitly, right? We understand what destruction does to a community, especially given today's era where the news, right, especially is so far and wide that we can know what's going on in Pakistan, right? We can see the destruction right there. That's a natural, but also it's part of, our not caring of the earth, right? So we understand the impacts of all of that. So how do we make sense of that as people today, of all of that, right? How do we see hope and life? How do we provide that, not as saviors trying to come in and help people, but how do we make that make sense in the context that we're in? What do we do today, here and now, as our people, as community, in the bigger picture, right? One of the readings noted something super important, right? Cliche, Micah 6:9, right? To do justice, right? Love kindness and walk humbly with our God, right? It's so small, so succinct, but that is a message to the Israelite people, and that is a message to us that also speak volumes. Because it's not hard to do, right? In a sense, it's not hard to do if we're paying attention to what God is doing in our lives and in the world. We're paying attention to what God has done through, right, the past and the present, right? The leaders here talk about the past and the present. Who were the leaders in the past? What did they do to create change, to follow God in the world? What are people presently doing, right? And what can we do to support them? What can we do to join alongside them in creating the atmosphere of hope and life, right? This mini cycle happens in some type of way, not to the extent, again, as the ancient Near East, but how do we make meaning of it today? So, any other comments in the chat box? Any other comments here from the group?
Nothing here.
No?
Well, I had a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of off topic, but then sort of on topic. So you speak of Yahweh, and then we speak of Jesus. So how did that change come with it? Just the names?
Yeah.
And then it seems like we're speaking more of Yahweh than, we did when I was in Bible school, so.
Yeah. So Yahweh is the name of God. It's not even like actual letters. It's kind of like a breathy saying for God, right?
Oh, so it's more God than Jesus.
Yep,
Yeah.
it's God. It's a description of God.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's not speak about Jesus, right? And again, it's going back to that difference in how our Jewish siblings use their scriptures to how we use our scriptures, right? So the Yahweh of Israel is not the Jesus Christ, the Messiah that we speak of as Christians, right? So it's a name for God that we can use. Thankfully, we get to have access to that. We use that. But it's also interesting that you asked that question because I think in seeing this, we also think of Yahweh as far removed, or we think of Yahweh as God out there, or the grumpy God of the Old Testament that we always see. But I would say for us, in understanding this cycle, if we want to make meaning out of that with Jesus, and anybody can correct me if you see it differently, but that God in Jesus is continuing that hope and that life, right? For us as Christians, so very specifically, right? Is it through Jesus continuing that hope and that life, right? Trying to make meaning of the Roman Empire, of those who survived that, who survived the death and violence of Jesus. And how do we bring hope and life? Well, again, death isn't the final say. Death doesn't have the final word. I don't know if I answered your question, but if there's more to that, I would love to hear it. Yeah.
Well, that's a start.
Okay.
That's a start. So, I mean, to me, that's like, oh, I had that all wrong. And so then I have to kind of get it organized.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And anytime you see, so in Deuteronomy 29, verse 1, where it says Lord, and it's like those lower caps, but it's all caps. Here, it says Lord there.
Lord there,
Yeah, that's Yahweh.
Okay.
So our translations kind of gloss over that, but that is in the original Hebrew.
Which is confusing, right? If you see Lord there and then you see Lord in the New Testament, and it's like trying to use it synonymously when it's not supposed to be used synonymously at all.
Yeah.
Right? What is the other name, Julie, they used for Yahweh, for God?
Elohim?
Is it Elohim?
I think I've heard that one.
I think so. There's one more that I'm thinking of. Maybe the English translation would also they use instead of Yahweh. I'm thinking of something and may be completely wrong. So I apologize. But yeah, that is confusing, and that's a great question, Jennifer. So that's what stinks is sometimes the translation doesn't accurately use the correct words that are technically used.
Don't pull it out from her.
John, I was just gonna sit. I'm thinking, wait a minute, where'd it
I'm
go?
watching how you sit.
So
Don't touch
Lord in all caps is referring to Yahweh.
Oh,
Is that what we just said?
In the Old Testament
In the Old
section.
Testament,
Yes,
yeah,
in
yeah.
the Old Testament.
Can you say
Okay.
that again?
Lord in the Old Testament section of the books of the Red Bibles is talking about Yahweh.
When it's all in caps.
When it's all caps,
Yeah.
like you see there on verse 20, verse 1 of chapter 29.
Yeah.
Adonai, that's exactly the word I was thinking
Yes,
of. Yes,
yes.
Adonai, because technically you're not supposed to, like Yahweh is very special name of God, so
Yeah.
they don't use Yahweh as often. So I believe is Adonai translated Lord.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's a capital L and then lowercase.
Yeah. So technically, even within their own translation of the scriptures, it's not Yahweh, it's Adonai because it's so sacred to use.
Can you spell it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adonai.
And you have that right there in your Bible?
It's actually in the front of all of our Bibles.
Oh, I see.
It's a
You
note
pointed
from
to something I thought
to
was-
the reader.
Oh, perfect.
This section, and then it's like really boring for everyone. But on this third page of it, they have a section down here kind of talks about
The names of
the
God.
names. Yeah,
That's great,
how they're translating it.
We're at the hour, but is there any other questions, comments, wonderings? This was really great. I'm really excited that we're in the minor prophets. And
Yes.
There's going to be some really good stuff I don't think we've talked about before. So, any other questions, comments from our Zoom team, from our people here?
Nope, I don't see anything from Zoom. What? I think Kathy's trying to say something. Oh. Oh, up here higher. And it's not recording it down where it says chat, so I'm sorry I missed it. Jesus is also the prophet of Yahweh after Moses. And then El Shaddai, there are many names used for God.
Yeah.
That's from Kathy. The other one was from Mandy. And from Mandy, Elohim is also used for God in the Old Testament, Lord. And then, yeah, someone mentioned Elohim already.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. But Adonai is the one I was looking for, 'cause that's the one that's most used in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Hebrews does talk about in the New Testament about Jesus as the new prophet,
Yeah.
as taking over from Moses, the greater prophet. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to let you know that the whatever's being put in the chat doesn't always show up in the chat. So keep trying, and hopefully, eventually, your message will get communicated.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Thank you, Zoomers. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Anything else?
May I bring up something that people might be interested in, but it's not directly about our study this morning?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me just share some books real fast, and then I'll let you go, Cheryl. So these are some of the books that Pastor Rebecca got for our study. You Are My People, an introduction to prophetic literature. So some of the notes that I have, and then I'll send over to you, is from here. I'm going to especially name this one, The Prophetic Literature by Marvin A. Sweeney. He is a professor at Claremont School of Theology, where I went to. He is Jewish and amazing scholar. Like, he cares about our relationship between our Jewish and Christian siblings, and brings really good history in this, again, as it pertains to like the Jewish literature and how they make meaning of that themselves. The You Are My People as well talks about the prophets as artists, which I thought was beautiful. You don't have time to get into that, but I thought that was really beautiful. I likened it to like the Beatles and a couple other artists talking about songs they created when natural disasters happen in the world, and how we try to talk about it, right? These prophets they confront it head on. They talk about the horrible things. They talk about the hard things. And that's really important as well to talk about. This last one, The Bible's Prophets by David Zucker. Again, really good stuff as a briefer introduction. But all of these go through each of the prophets and have an introduction. They're really good. So if you want, I can send those in the email as well. But thank you all. I'm excited for us to get started in our study. Yeah.
Yeah, thank
Really
you.
great questions too.
For all
Yeah.
your study.
It's been many